So my talk today is about specifically the language arts in our lower school and what they look like and how they lead into the Great Books program. As I mentioned in a previous talk, coming from higher education, I always taught English, theology, subjects that required a lot of writing. And so I think I say this later in the talk, but I've been grading papers professionally since I was 20 years old. But always kind of at the end of the road, even master's degree students grading their papers. I once actually got fired as a teaching assistant in grad school because I cared too much about grammar. So I was like, fine, I don't want to do this anymore. But it's been really fascinating for me to take a look all the way down and see, at least develop a theory of where some of these problems that I've seen for 15 years on the other end of things are coming from. So that's what I'm going to try to talk about today. I'd like to start with a suggestion. We dedicate an immense amount of our young children's lives to school. And yet somehow, most children are significantly less well-educated in the liberal arts than past generations have been. This is a tricky premise in some ways because we have higher literacy rates than any time in the past worldwide. More people are graduating high school, going to college, etc. And I don't dispute this. I want to claim something a little different and maybe something that won't really show up. It doesn't show up or can't be measured by the same statistics, but I think can be fairly understood fairly clearly from our understanding of history. Perhaps it would help if I put it like this. For the amount of time that we put our children in school, the years and years we dedicate to pre-K through 12th grade education, they are being massively underserved in the liberal arts. They spend significantly more years in school than their grandparents or great-grandparents, and yet somehow these years that they're spending are not producing better readers or stronger thinkers or a better educated, more thoughtful culture. Somehow we're getting worse. And this doesn't make much sense. I wanted to start here because in describing our language arts program, I want first to try to show you what's at stake, why we're bothering to do things differently and make some pretty radical departures from a more conventional and certainly easier path to literacy in our students. There's a particular statistic that I've shared with our high schoolers a lot before, but I think it sheds light on this particular premise as well. The literacy rate, as of 2015, in the US is at its highest it's ever been, about 86%. That's not what it should be, but it's higher than any other time in history. But what I found even more interesting was a second number that's listed right alongside it. Approximately 86% of Americans can read and write to the extent needed to read instructions, signs, writing for basic entertainment like an article online, which is what the Institute for Education Science, working with the census, describes as literate. But only 15% are what are called fully literate, or reading at an undergraduate level. In other words, somewhere along the way, we lose over 70% of Americans between when they learn to read at a basic level and when they learn to read really well. 70%. By the way, the percentage of Americans who graduate from college is 33.4%. So I'll let you draw your own conclusions about what it means that 30% of people are graduating from college and only 15% can read at a college level. That seems like a problem as well, but for a different subject. Why is this? How do we lose 70% of Americans between reading signs and instructions and being able to read and understand, "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediment," or "We the people of the United States of America in order to form a more perfect union"? What's going wrong that allows us to spend 12 to 14 years in school without college and still not be able to read anything that borders on important or beautiful or significant? This same issue has been reflected in my own experience in ways that have long baffled me. I've been grading papers professionally since I was 20. First as a student worker, then a graduate assistant, then as a teacher and a college professor. I worked my way through college and grad school working at an engineering firm in which my primary job, I did some like phone sales and stuff, even though I didn't understand the product I was selling at all. My primary job was to rewrite people's emails. So the engineers would send me what they wanted to say, and I would turn it into English, because that's had to happen in order to actually sell things to the general public. From the time I was doing this, grading papers as a graduate assistant, a teacher, and a college professor, I was doing so in the relatively elite world of private higher ed. For the time I was teaching assistant in college, I should have been experiencing the writing, thinking, and communication skills of the top 30% of Americans. And I was. And they were bad. In grad school, I was astounded by the number of people seeking master's degree who did not know how to spell, write multiple kinds of sentences correctly, or maintain paragraphs that could just focus clearly and keenly on a single idea. Those are pretty basic writing skills. The same absences in their education, wherever they were coming from, that kept them from being good writers, kept them from understanding hard books or complex arguments, as I often experienced as their classmate and later as their teacher in classes. As the students I was working with were almost always studying theology or literature, this is a huge problem. If we have theologians or potential pastors and priests who are going on and they've never learned to analyze because they don't have a grasp on the English language that would allow them to do so. My first job as a teacher for students younger than undergraduates started 6 years ago here in Houston. My now husband and I traveled to 4 or 5 private schools and homeschool co-ops a week for years at a time, teaching dual enrollment students for HBU. The schools we taught at often charged tens of thousands of dollars a year in tuition. And we were teaching their top 10% of their juniors and seniors. You had to apply to be in our classes. You had to have a 3.8 or above. We had homeschooled students who came to HBU campus twice a week to take classes there. Universally, across all of these schools and programs, these students were bright, engaged, they wanted good grades, they had good schools and parental support. They were privileged students. And yet they couldn't read. I mean, they could read words pretty okay. Some actually couldn't. I did have a couple students who would come to us and really just not be able to read. They just kind of faked their way through because they were clever. If all we had been asking for was for them to repeat instructions or gain a single salient point from a news article or a particular little piece of literature that we handed them, they probably would have done fine. But if we put something new in front of them, which we do as great books instructors, something they hadn't seen before, something that was foreign or difficult or, God forbid, in poetic verse, it's terrifying, and you ask, what is he saying? I'd instantly lose at least half the class. They have no idea. They simply had not been taught to understand the English language, to analyze it, and to master it. They had been taught to memorize the words they would use the most in their life and then move on. By the way, at the high school point, when we're meeting people at 14 to 16 years old, to gain the ability to read well for them at this point was possible. And many students did it. On average, it would take about 3 months for a student to get confident enough to know they could do it. For those 3 months, they were always just like, get me out of here. Like, I'm going to fail. I don't know what's going on. And I would tell parents, give us 3 months. Like, give us 3 months. It would take about another year before they could really feel like they were doing it well. And that's if they worked really, really hard. And it was only students who maintained real personal motivation who would do this because it was really hard. It's hard to make up for all that lost time. As you can imagine, the same stunted understanding of the English language would be reflected in their writing. Even students whose grammar or mechanics was fairly good really struggled in understanding and analysis and explanation. They have an argument in their head, and they just can't get it on paper in a way that makes sense to a reader. They just hadn't mastered a vocabulary or a way of thinking through that vocabulary that allowed them to think fluently and with complexity. They didn't have the words that they needed to express their ideas. So, when given the opportunity to design the lower school curriculum, one of my highest priorities was to change this for our students. I wanted to find out what was going wrong and why in this information age where we see more writing, more text, more communication than ever before, why we weren't understanding it. I didn't include this in the talk. I really thought about it, but there's a couple of really good articles in a book that's been presented about why the ability to read critically is maybe the most essential component to maintaining a democracy, right? If you are going to be a free person in a free society, you have to have, one, information that's accurate, but two, the ability to analyze it and to make a decision, or else how are you going to be a voter that does anything good or a participant in a democracy, which that's been really influential in my thinking as well. From what I know now through research and the advice of several key experts that we've consulted, I think we've developed a working theory from which we've built our language arts curriculum. Before I get to what we do specifically, let me tell you a few key facts that have most influenced our decisions and our direction. It's going to feel like a change of subject at first, and I wasn't here at the beginning of Megan's talk, so I don't know if she got to any of this, but I promise it'll all come back to language arts. When taking preschool and kindergarten into account, school age is significantly younger by at least 3 years than it has traditionally been anywhere in the world. The philosophy behind lowering school age sounds really simple and straightforward. If you start learning earlier, you learn more. You got more years to do it. It has overwhelmingly been shown to simply not work that way at all, nor contain any of the benefits that we thought it might. In 2013, a University of Cambridge researcher from the Faculty of Education, David Whitebread, published a letter alongside a bunch of research that he did, signed by 130 other early childhood experts and educators across the UK, advocating a putting off of all formal education until the age of 7 at the very earliest. This letter was based on his own extensive research done by Dr. Whitehead and others that overwhelmingly supports, those are his words, the benefits of free play and exploration for young children. He concluded that, quote, in the interest of children's academic achievement and their emotional well-being, the government of the United Kingdom has to take this evidence seriously. The benefits of giving children the room and time to be kids before formal schooling started are so powerful. Dr. Whitehead was concerned about the emotional well-being of the public of the United Kingdom if there weren't change. Interest in lowering school age seems often political because it's economical. It is hard and expensive to raise young children at home because it requires a parent to be there. Can't just leave them. Politicians can score really easy points by advocating for universal preschool programs or something like that. It sounds pro-mom, it sounds pro-family and pro-child, but nobody seems to focus on what actually works best for the student. A study done by 2 German scholars in 2005 used data from the entire country of Sweden, which holds a firm start date of compulsory education for the year that the student turns 7. But they do it based on a calendar year, which made for an interesting metric of study, because if you turned 7 in January, you started school that year. If you turned 7 the December before, you didn't. So they had these groups of students who were virtually the same age, but started school a year apart. Using a rich data set, these are their words, for an entire Swedish population born between 1935 and 84, we find that children who start school at an older age do better in school and go on to have more education than their younger peers. Perhaps most interestingly, children from families with weaker educational tradition and support have more to win from starting school late than others. They conclude that this has to do with a student's higher level of what they called absolute maturity. So this does vary in ages from different children, but students with higher levels of absolute maturity when starting school do better over many years than students who are put into highly structured programs at a young age. Even the difference between 7 and 8, can you imagine starting school at 8? Any American would think you were crazy, right, if you held off until 8 years old. Meant students were more ready, more willing, and flourishing. Now, what I want to be clear about here is what I'm saying. I bring my kid, who's not 2, to school every single day. And he loves it. He tries to get us to come on Saturday. He was like so excited that we were going to school today. It's not their location that matters as much as what they do with their day, right? He's in a small class of kids his age, and they just run around. Like, that's, as far as I can tell, that's just all they do, just run around all day. And he's really excited and happy. There's more for him to do here than he would be in our home. The thing I think we need to take really seriously when we're talking about our curriculum is, are we forcing children into structures and systems that they're simply not ready for? Not where are they going, but what are they doing while they're there? If so, we might be doing something that's at the peril of their future success. I tried to find the actual statistic because it's been a long time, but there was this crazy study done in Singapore where they didn't introduce students to formal math until they were in 6th grade. By the time they were in high school, they far surpassed their peers. Because you can just pick up numeracy, your brain was working right. And they weren't bored by math. They didn't think like, oh my gosh, I gotta go back to math class. They were like, look at this cool new thing I'm doing. And so they just went crazy because they were curious, they were ready. And for a 12-year-old to pick up addition, it happens super, super fast. No, they don't, which is interesting. Like, I've never seen anyone actually practice it. But they were, because it's kind of a weird study to do, right? Be like, no, don't look at math. Now, oddly, classical schools haven't seemed, which classical schools try really hard to take the developmental area or the developmental place of students into consideration when we're applying our curriculum to them, and yet we generally have not taken this downward creep of school age into account when we talk about the trivium or traditional stages of education. We start our pre-Kers on material that we've been told is good for young children and is ready, that they're ready for and they will do well, seemingly forgetting that the ancients and medievals, when they're talking about young children, are talking about 10-year-olds, 9-year-olds maybe. They're not talking about 4-year-olds, and yet we're trying to apply those same ideas 5 years earlier. And that seems foolish to me. Taking these things into account, our job as a school administration is to build a program that allows young children to be where they are and to be who they are at 4, 5, 6, and 7 before forcing them into structures that were never designed for them. This will have a direct impact on the kind of academic accomplishments, though, that we're going to be able to show off in our young children. They might not have any, because we won't be asking them to do the same things that their peers in more conventional programs will be doing. And it's because we're in it for the long haul. So what does this mean specifically for the language arts? Elizabeth and Sarah this afternoon are going to talk more extensively about what that looks like in an overall early childhood classroom. But because this has a real effect on how we treat the language arts, I wanted to start there too. From these studies and cries for us to think well about early childhood education, I don't want to focus on forcing your child to read paragraphs at 6 years old. They could do it. But if slowing them down in the beginning is going to help them get there, and I think it will, then that's what we're going to do. If it's going to help them get to the point where they're ready to read Shakespeare at 13, that's what I care about. I don't care that they're reading Dick and Jane books at 5. I care that they're ready to read difficult language by the time they're in junior high and they're ready for it. In doing so, we're slowing down the acquisition of read and written language because I think in slowing it down, we're able to do it better. Sight word or whole word approaches to learning how to read have been in vogue for many years now because of the seemingly rapid results they produce, and they do. You teach a young child, 4-year-olds can do it. My niece in her school in California is doing it right now. Within the first week of school, she had learned to read. You teach young children to memorize a certain set of words and what they mean. Words like ball, cat, pat, sat, hat, dog, bad, dad, etc. They can see the letters, they memorize the word, and they figure it out. After they master these word sets, you put them in basic sentences, in little books, and boom, your child is reading. And they are, sort of. Whole word education is super fast and effective, and it makes you feel like you're really getting somewhere. It also allows young children to get to the kind of read instruction level of reading early, which helps them take exams, if that's what they need to do in school. The problem is, this is not an effective or even competent way to really tackle the English language. In her speech to the Oregon Senate, Wanda Sensari, author of the Spell to Write and Read curriculum that we use here, points out, English is the most vital language in the world, the first truly global language. Over half of the people who use English do not speak it as their mother tongue. It's at least secondary. English has also the richest vocabulary on the planet. The modern Chinese dictionary has 12,000 entries. The French vocabulary has less than 100,000 words. But the Oxford English Dictionary contains 500,000 words. What she doesn't mention here, but is just as relevant to our consideration, is it's also a language of borrowed words. We use words from Latin, Greek, French, and Germanic roots all the time, often building even simple sentences with words that come from all over the world. The vastness and complexity of the English language often makes it feel as if, and is popularly decried, our language is illogical, irregular, full of constant exceptions, making spelling and reading a particularly difficult subject to teach. But Sensari disagrees about this last point. It's not that our language is a crazy mess. It's that we're not learning or teaching its foundations correctly. We're trying to memorize something that cannot be memorized. You cannot memorize 500,000 words. She asserts instead that through learning just 70 phonograms and 28 spelling rules, you will have the tools to phonetically explain, comprehend, understand 99% of the words that we use commonly, and 87% of every single word in the Oxford English Dictionary. Phonemic awareness in education unlocks the English language, but we have to take the time to study it. I wanted to read you a mother's testimonial about Spell to Write and Read because I think it shows a good difference between approaching the language from a phonemic standpoint versus whole word, and the difference it can make in a child. She says, for about 4 years, my son was taught with the sight method first. This resulted in him being able to read a little better, but he couldn't spell. He couldn't write neatly, nor compose thought. He had spelling words and sight words each week. He often got all his main spelling words correct on Friday night, on Friday's test, but on Monday, he couldn't spell a single word. Basically, he wasn't learning anything, and all of his intervention plan was sight-based. After 2 special needs programs, I started teaching him at home with Spell to Write and Read, which taught him to link the sound to a symbol, not to a letter name. This proved to be a really important key to helping him decode and then encode the language. Using the combination of senses, and that's part of the method, is they're got, like, you may see them with boxes of salt, and they're using their hands, or they've got markers, they're doing all sorts of stuff. They always hear the word before they see it from the teacher, or the sound, so they'll make the sound with the teacher. So they use all their different senses to get a hold of these phonemic pieces. Using the combination of sentence, he could retain the word. He needed to use the 4 senses of hearing, speaking, writing, and reading in this particular order: hearing, speaking, writing, then reading, in order to retain the words. This method is a simultaneously multisensory approach, which made a big difference. The specific blending of the senses or pathways used by the mind, as presented in Spell to Write and Read, reached my son and unlocked his ability to finally process the language. The progression for teaching a child to read is as follows: sounds of speech, penmanship, that's a weird element, spelling, logic, composition, grammar, and then spontaneous reading. Notice reading is the last step, not the first. The clean and clear presentation of the phonics code in Spell to Write and Read is a method that I have found to yield the results that the sight method just can't produce. Several other endorsements I've read are from teachers of students with some language acquisition difficulties or delays, especially dyslexia. Learning the logic of phonics helps unlock the English language because they can't get to memorization. Their mind doesn't quite work that way. Their sight messes it up. They just can't quite do it. But learning the logic of phonics is still available to them. So why doesn't everybody do it? Because it takes a really long time. If you're spending a couple years learning phonograms and spelling rules, you're not impressing your parents with your ability to read Dr. Seuss at 6 years old. You might still be sounding out ball when you see it on a piece of paper, saying all. Separating it into phonograms and sounding like you can't read, because you can't. You're not there yet. Reading is the last step, not the first. Add to that the forgotten value of training a child in penmanship, which we're working on simultaneously, and you've got another reason to slow down because you're waiting for them to write it all, and it's taking forever. They're like, But you've got another reason to slow down a bit, to learn one's letters, and then phonograms, and finally words. But if you put that together with how early we're starting school, we have 4 years of a time of lots of play and lots of invention, lots of time outside to slow down and to use this time in pre-K through 2nd grade to learn these things. We slow way down. We leave lots of time for play, imaginative conversation, music, painting, and outdoor time, and we learn the foundations of the English language over 4 years, remembering that our 4 to 6-year-olds in particular need to not be tied to their desks because they need to be exploring and playing and being kids. By the time our students are ending 2nd grade, they will be using the spelling list that they've been building over 4 years. And those are really structured. If you ever look at the Spell to Write and Read curriculum, I'm not actually the person to talk to about it because I never have taught Spell to Write and Read, except for I subbed for Mr. Antuzzi when he was on paternity leave, and I kept getting all the, I don't write cursive the way the students are taught. I was never taught to write cursive. So mine sort of adapted, and so they kept being like, that's not what you do. And I was like, fine, you do it. You write on the board. Yeah. But you should talk to any of your Spell to Write and Read teachers. The spelling lists are structured. They build on one another. What is it? Spelling list A through Z? It's far. They're like they go for a long time. But they build on one another so that you're retaining every list as you go along. Something I learned last year is that English is one of the only languages in which we do competitive spelling contests. Most languages that would not be an interesting sport, right? Like, I can spell, and they're like, yeah, everybody can spell, it's super easy. But in English, it's hard, it's actually hard. Like you have the spelling bee because it's a real challenge. So learning how to spell words properly will get them to the point that at the end of 2nd grade, they're using their spelling lists that they've been building for a couple of years in those language logs that you guys may see if you go into the classrooms, in order to write sentences. Sentences that will be properly understood, properly spelled, written in their own handwriting, thoroughly understood, and legible, ideally. That's our whole goal. Between the value we place on allowing students to be their age and not rush into academic work that could stunt or bore or confuse them, and believing that learning the building blocks for the English language properly is worth a few years, language arts in the lowest grades will look really different here than elsewhere. Now, so far, I've only focused on part of it. I've only focused on spell to write and read. But alongside of that, and this is really, really important, students are being read aloud to throughout the day from a carefully selected long list of excellent children's literature. I actually tried to print this out for you, and I can't find it. I don't know if the printer just ignored me. So, did you see it? Someone stole it. Yeah. But I compiled on yesterday a list of all the books that we read in pre-K through 8th grade. In pre-K through 2nd grade, the lists are hugely long because they're packages that we purchase of just great read-aloud books that the teachers can choose from. But there's usually about 30 to 40 of them. But you can, a variety. It's a huge variety because we also allow the students who are reading to explore the books themselves. Yeah, so they'll have time to both read on their own if that's where they're at. And some students absolutely will be. So they're being read aloud to throughout the day from a carefully selected long list of excellent children's literature. Those who are ready will also be given, yeah, there it is, given readers to work through and storybooks of all kinds of free reading. Some students, about 1 in 4, statistically speaking, are just naturally early readers. They're going to be ready, they're going to want to do it, they're super motivated, which is great. That doesn't interfere with them learning phonemic awareness or all that stuff. Interestingly enough, students who are naturally early readers tend to learn by sight words, so we have to make sure they're also building those other skills so they don't reach a point where they hit a wall. They will also, students in pre-K through, well really through 6th grade, memorize poetry and scripture from dictation, so it'll be spoken to them and they'll remember to speak it back and learn it, and learn to narrate stories that they've heard from their teachers back. This is a huge piece. So before you have composition where you're asking a student to actually build paragraphs correctly, one of the things I worry about is in too early composition is all little guys are train of thought people, right? They're just going to be like, and then this happened, and this happened, this happened. You're like, what is this story? Like, exactly where did you go? Or, you know, it's very hard sometimes to keep track, but it makes sense to them. Narration is a really great way of practicing how to kind of rein that in without having to rely on their writing skills. So we read a story in class, and then you say, you know, David, what was that story about? And he'll tell us back what he just heard. You'll often see drawings that go along with reading aloud too. So, and that's really funny because what they decide to draw from the story is often so varied, and I'm like, I don't remember the bear with the gun in the Chronicles of Narnia. And they were like, no, it's this guy. And you're like, that was a beaver, and he was eating, whatever. So, but it's fun. They you know, something hits them and they draw it out. So there's lots of ways to continue to develop strong language awareness in even a very, very young student, while keeping it feeling much more like play than work, which is really important. After 4 years of this foundational preparation, students in the 3rd grade will begin a word that I have never correctly pronounced, the progymnasmata. The progymnasmata. I'm going to have to say it like 4 more times in the next paragraph, so, which is a comprehensive ancient set of exercises through which students learn composition. So by the time they're starting 3rd grade, they're going to start with fables and stories, but there are 9 levels of exercises through the I'm just going to call it the progym. So, yeah, it's P-R-O, gym, G-Y-M, and then nas, N-A-S, mata, M-A-T-A. Yes, very Greek, very ancient, and it's a set of exercises through which students will learn composition and rhetorical skills. So it's meant to be communicative verbally as well. That will be so to help them become excellent, creative, and winsome communicators and writers. The progymnasmata, quote, assumes no basic skills. Every skill is taught as the exercises progress. In the article, the very idea of the progymnasmata, which is behind a bunch of like firewalls and JSTOR and academic things, the author writes that what is most valuable about the program is the very idea of a unified pedagogical program in the language arts, which are very hard to find, that is oriented toward the shaping of a rhetorical character and organized around a sequence of well-defined exercises in verbal analysis and composition. So once we have all those core skills down where we know our words, we continue working with spell to write and read spelling lists through at least 6th grade. So they don't give up on that piece either because the words keep getting more complicated, but they should know those core things by the time they're in 3rd grade. The earliest of the progymnasmata starts with fable. So we learn through story and short narratives with meaning, and they're going to imitate some of these fables or create their own and work through those exercises and practices that instruct a student in various writing genres and styles. This goes from fable to argument to thesis to there's 9 different ones, and I always am forgetting them. Mr. Mueller knows them better. And we're going to continue this program through 8th grade. They begin with fable to build paragraphs and stories and exercise their creative muscles, because who is more creative than the average 9-year-old, as they practice composition for the first time. This is the first year that we've instituted the progymnasmata using Classical Academic Press's Writing and Rhetoric curriculum. So if you want to look it up, Classical Academic Press is the publisher, Writing and Rhetoric is the curriculum. Our 3rd graders will do 1 book for the first year, but then from then on you'll do 2 a year so that you can get through the 9 levels. Alongside this, as their composition program, 3rd through 5th graders will have a reading list of 5 to 7 whole books a year, all chapter books, and continued study. Some of those they start by reading aloud in class. And then a continued study of spell to write and read spelling words to keep up on spelling rules, and a program that was written alongside Writing and Rhetoric, which is called Well-Ordered Language, which is our grammar curriculum, to ensure that they have, alongside the creative and rhetorical skills that come with composition, a strong understanding of the knowledge of English mechanics. This is where they're going to learn things like what's a noun, what's a verb. Miss Mikey was telling me they learned this song about parts of speech, right? That's what it is, and it's like stuck in her head. She like can't get it out. It's driving her crazy. Poetry, monologue, and scripture memorization and recitation will continue, along with opportunities to flex their dramatic muscles in theater and music, all of which work together to kind of have this fully orbed experience of the English language. We continue studying the progymnasmata through 8th grade using writing and rhetoric, while in 6th grade, adding on to that, the beginning of the Great Books program. Great Books is a 7-year series with a couple distinctions that kind of move us into junior high and high school, one being the sheer amount of reading. So I think the 6th graders read something like 12 to 15 books. By the time you're a senior, you're reading 20 to 30. Our seniors read War and Peace over the summer. Our juniors are going to have about 5,000 pages of reading this year. And it's not easy. It's not easy stuff. But then the other component of it is it's a Socratic classroom for really the first time, which is appropriate to the developmental level of the 12-year-old. This is where you start to ask a whole bunch of questions. And like I said in the earlier talk, understanding becomes a really key part of your flourishing. You have to know why you're doing the things. You have to start knowing why you're thinking the things that you are. I won't talk much about the Great Books program here. Mr. Gilbert and Mr. Mueller are actually talking about it right now down the hall, which is being recorded. So if you want to listen to it, you can. And I'd really encourage you to do so because it's kind of the second half of where the language arts curriculum and goals are going. But I will say that's my area of expertise. I have seen the study of the great books and Socratic education transform students who could barely read into passionate and careful readers and thinkers in just the course of a few years. I found this on the cubbies when I was sitting over there. And it's a piece of paper that I assume Mr. Reynolds printed out and says, 6th grade great books recitation. Memorize and recite this selection from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes story, The Naval Treaty. I just want you to hear the first part of it, because the students are going to be memorizing this and then reciting it to their class. What a lovely thing a rose is. He walked past the couch to the open window and held up the drooping stalk of a moss rose, looking down at the dainty blend of crimson and green. It was a new phase of his character to me, for I had never before seen him show any keen interest in natural objects. There is nothing in which deduction is so necessary as in religion, said he, leaning back against the shutters. It can be built up as an exact science by the reasoner. Our highest assurance of the goodness of providence seems to me to rest in the flowers. And it continues on from there. But I wanted you to hear the language. It's complex language. These are not easy words, but they're words that we expect our 6th grader to not only be able to read, but to memorize and then to recite clearly. And they won't be able to do that if they don't know how to break the words up, because they may never have seen crimson before. It's not a word we use every single day. And so it's interesting that that's what they're working on and where they're going. As I said, I've seen the study of great books and Socratic education transform students who could barely read into passionate and careful readers and thinkers in just the course of a few short years. It's one of the things I'm most passionate about in the world, because I've seen it take a 7th grader with the memory of a goldfish with no attention span who drives me crazy to a 12th grader who I would gladly spend hours of my week talking to, whose writing is a privilege to read and whose ideas are deep and thoughtful and original. We fight over teaching our 12th graders because it's not really teaching. It's just, you get to just enjoy them by that point and have these rich and interesting conversations over some of the world's best, most interesting subjects. I've experienced this same thing firsthand in my own life. As a 14-year-old, I had no confidence in my own ideas. I could barely write an essay, and I didn't really read much. I wasn't a reader. 4 years of studying the great books in high school in a Socratic environment had me presenting a senior thesis to 40 people, parents and peers, and going off to study English literature for college. I know what a great high school education can do. What I've not seen yet is a student who gets the right foundation from the very beginning, who's taught to read with the nature of a complex and vibrant language in mind, who's been given a chance to develop all their emotional and personal milestones at a speed that's best for them, and when they're little. And then challenged to take those foundations wide and deep when they're ready. But I think I'm about to, and I can't wait. That's it from me.